Well, thank you so much for joining
Very
us. I
excited.
I just feel like you have so much to offer people. So many people are
Mm,
just learning about this amazing brew that comes out of the Amazon,
mm.
and and I feel like you're someone who can really give people insight into how to use the medicine, what it's for, and also how to keep it sacred. And that's another thing, reason why we want to do this show is to really hammer it in. Like, what is ayahuasca?
Thank you.
And a lot of people just don't understand what ayahuasca is. I've done it, maybe 10 times now.
Mm.
And so I, by no means am I calling myself an expert, but each time I do it, I discover a little bit more about the medicine and feel like it has tremendous potential, especially in the
Mm.
West, to heal mental health disorders. And not only that, just heal lack of spirit, lack of
Oh
spirituality.
yeah.
What do you think ayahuasca is?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Even now, like, so I've been working with it 18 years, as you know, and it's a really difficult question to answer still relative to what it does and how it works. But generally, it's the basic description is that it's a psychoactive tea, which is what it is, because it's two plants combined that only work in synergy together, which is really interesting. And it consistently, the mystery of it is that it consistently causes what we call spiritual experiences or really deep introspective, I don't know what you call it, like psychological exploration. Like you can really get into the psyche with ayahuasca that you, in a way that you can't with any other entheogen or even substance that I'm aware of.
And for those who aren't quite familiar, what is an entheogen?
It's
It,
really interesting. It almost literally translates to God within. So it's substances that cause a spiritual experience or a catalyst for a spiritual experience. All right. So it's relatively new. I think in the last maybe 20 years that I first heard that term, entheogen, as opposed to a psychedelic. Like for me, I would say like LSD would be a psychedelic and a really effective one, depending on what you're using it for. Whereas mushrooms, ayahuasca, more the organic substances are considered entheogens. Right.
and I like that word too because I feel like the
Mm.
word psychedelic has been so
Oh yeah,
there's been so much negative propaganda toward it.
exactly.
If you even now saying journalistically I'm focusing on psychedelics, some people are like, "What?"
Exactly.
But when I say entheogens, it's like, "Oh, that sounds
Yeah,
interesting. What are
yeah,
those?"
and I think too because psychedelic brings up people tripping. You know, the idea of like what you're experiencing on a quote unquote psychedelic is just you tripping, so somehow it's not a valid experience. Whereas the experiences people have on entheogens are usually really cathartic and deep and long lasting. You know, they're actually transformative. So I like the separation too. But in that context, psychedelic or like LSD could actually be an entheogen depending on the context of how it's used.
And so, how is ayahuasca made? I know that somehow
Yeah.
the natives in the Amazon figured out how to combine these two
Yeah,
plants
it's
out of
miraculous.
thousands and thousands of plant species. They weren't experts,
Hmm.
botanists by any means. And so, can you describe for us how ayahuasca is made and how the heck natives figured out how to make this?
You know, that's the big mystery, but it's really fascinating. A group of anthropologists early on contacted a lot of separated tribes, you know, and asked all the shamans, so how did you know to combine these two plants? And in every case, they said the same thing: the plants told us, right? And the interesting thing about that to me is it's like, you know, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Because when you're in an ayahuasca experience, particularly in nature, you could actually see someone like walking around and having the experience of a plant talking to you, right? And I kind of think, well, that makes sense. But they weren't on it when they discovered that. Yeah, so a good friend of ours, he leads ceremonies in the Santo Daime tradition, and that's an ayahuasca church out of Brazil. He was telling us a story about like biophotons and how at night in the jungle, plants actually are kind of illuminated. And he says, and given how sensitive you become in ayahuasca, you know, and other entheogens, because they were doing other kind of ritual ceremonies there, for him, it kind of made sense that you're so sensitized to nature living in the jungle. He said you probably actually could walk around, and if you're looking for a particular plant for like a healing modality, that it might speak to you. But the interesting thing about that, there's new research that shows that the predominant healing modality in the rainforest is purgatory. It's finding plants that will cause you to purge. Like if you get poisoned or sick, you want to be able to get it out of your body quickly. And at least the Psychotropis viridis, what they call the female aspect of the ayahuasca tea, looks like a lot of those plants. So there's actually some speculation that most likely they were looking for healing plants and stumbled, oh, take this one, it'll make you purge. And guess what? You also tripped for 12 hours. so, so it's a speculation that maybe that's how it was kind of discovered. But the fact that they combined the two, though, is still pretty miraculous.
So ayahuasca is made by it is a brew.
Yeah.
It tastes I compare it to it tastes like stale coffee mixed with cough syrup, something that it
Yeah.
instantly what would you say, Tony? It
I've
kind of
told
makes you want to
people it's kind
gag.
of like molasses mixes meets vinegar. I don't know, and eat them together. But that depends on how it's brewed. I've had brews that are really close to literally like honey, and some
Mhm.
that are really vile, like vinegar, and you can barely get them down.
And it's this thick brown substance. It's
Most
made
often, yeah,
and it's made by combining the chacruna leaves often
right.
or a plant that contains DMT with the
Hmm.
ayahuasca vine,
Yeah,
which is the
Banisteriopsis
MAOI.
caapi, right?
You know the scientific terminology better than
I've
I do.
had to. Yeah.
And so that allows the DMT to be absorbed by your body, which then sends you on this incredible trip. And something that I
Yep.
think makes ayahuasca so fascinating for so many people, including myself, I used it
Mm,
for a lot of healing, not only spirituality,
mm,
but also to kind of process traumatic events that had happened in my life. And what I felt like the ayahuasca did was actually get into my brain and my subconscious and release trapped memories,
yeah, literally.
and then I was able to process them. And
Hmm.
I think that's what's so fascinating about this brew and what makes it so applicable to being able to heal people in the West, because we just don't have many outlets to purge this trauma. So
Precisely.
so many of us are walking around carrying this bottled up trauma with us. What ways have you seen ayahuasca heal people or even heal yourself?
Such a big question. We could spend all day just talking about that. But the short answer is very similar to what you're talking about. It is very fascinating that, and maybe it's also because of the ceremony, because we know it has the ability to do this. We've probably tailored the ayahuasca ceremonies to some degree so that they can actually it'll be a catalyst for these experiences. But the most common experience and the thing I've most seen healed in ayahuasca ceremonies are depression, and any kind of trauma related, either illness or, well, mental or physical illness related to trauma. And it does it mainly by doing exactly what you just brought up. Somehow it very safely brings people back to the original trauma or back to the origin of whatever the dis-ease is. And you're actually able to move into that space in a safe way and process it. And the beautiful thing about, I think, entheogens versus psychedelics, drugs, tripping, is that it's a lasting effect. When people say, oh, well, of course you had that experience, you were tripping. Like, no, not true, because the next morning at least with a ceremony that has an integration period. I've had people just recently, actually, a friend shared with me that at an ayahuasca experience she was at, that she went because she was on her last leg, with depression. It got to the point where she was barely able to function, and she was on all the drugs and various dosages of those drugs. And she finally thought, okay, I'll try this ayahuasca thing. And it's now been 6 months, and she's been completely off all medications and back in the swing of life. And for her, she says, I'm healed. Yeah, so she's a complete, I don't know, cheerleader now for ayahuasca as a healing modality.
It really is
Mm,
fascinating. I think so many antidepressants, the prescription ones, they're
mm,
kind of putting like a band-aid on the bullet
yeah,
wound. They
yeah,
don't actually get in and address the trauma. It's just fixing the symptoms.
precisely.
Whereas even for me personally, and so many people you've interacted with, Tony, it really gets in there and purges this trauma. One time I was on ayahuasca and my parents had had a pretty traumatic divorce when I was a
Mm,
kid. I mean, it was pretty. It was tough to witness as a child, and I didn't
right.
realize I had absorbed so much of their
Mm,
fighting. And one of the first things ayahuasca did when I was on it was bring me back to that moment when I was a kid, and I started processing memories of my parents fighting
yeah,
when I was 4, and I didn't realize that I'd been carrying that baggage with me
exactly.
my entire life, which led to anxiety later in life. And when I was able to process that and woke up the next morning after my ayahuasca experience, I just felt like a tremendous
Liberated,
amount
yeah?
of yeah.
Yeah,
I just felt
literally.
like my heart had been open and these bricks had been taken off my shoulders, and it was just so fascinating that journalistically I knew at that point I'm like people need to know about this medicine. It can help so many people who
Yeah.
just feel like there's no hope.
It's amazing, when I got introduced to ayahuasca 18 years ago through the Santo Daime Church, which is again the ayahuasca church that started in Brazil. And Fred invited me to participate in one of those ceremonies. And my first thought, I remember like the weeks following the ceremony, it was really powerful. But I thought, well, this is really awesome, but I don't want to keep doing this because I'm concerned about my psychological, and mental well-being. And a lot of people have that concern, but shortly thereafter, I read a study that they had done in Brazil, which was part of his legalization process there. And they researched people that had been drinking like regularly, like twice a month for like almost like over a 30-year period. And not only were they completely healthy, they were healthier and smarter. They tested higher cognitively over this period of time. So at that point, I thought, well, that's it, because I'm really interested in this medicine and I'm going to study it. And for me, it's like, yeah, 18 years later, I am definitely a smarter person in terms of being more conscious and the ability to be centered in one's own being, I would call it, and to assimilate information um, has definitely improved, in my life. And I've watched so many people go through this amazing curve, of coming in wounded in various ways, either like physically or traumatically, psychologically. And within like a year of on and off again, going to South America, wherever they're finding access to the medicine, it's profound, the transformation. Yeah. So at some point I thought, that's it. I want to dedicate myself to at least being an advocate, you know. Yeah. And having said that, I want to make that clear. Like, I am positively not an advocate for quote unquote drug use, and don't advocate that anybody does anything illegal. At the same time, I realize, how ridiculous is it that we have these amazing substances that are actually safe and proven effective, yet we're all cheerleading, alcohol and poisonous pharmaceuticals that are relatively ineffective.
And alcohol, if for people who want to know really about dangerous drugs, alcohol is the most dangerous drug,
Exactly.
alcohol and tobacco.
I mean, literally, it's poison, right?
And they're both legal. So then at that point,
And
you have to
celebrated.
realize that this isn't based on science. These regulations aren't
Right.
based on science. And it's really traumatic to know that nature is being made illegal. That we're literally being
Yep.
told you cannot ingest a tea that comes from two natural plants
Yeah.
or
I
mushrooms
was just
that grow
sharing
on.
that with a friend on the drive here, actually. Yeah, this very story that even looking at like cannabis, it's really wonderful that we're living in a time to see like 20 states, I guess now it's either legal or in the process of. Yet when you think about it, here's this plant that grows literally like a weed on the side of the freeway, if we allowed it to, that everybody has access to. Yeah, it's amazing the amount of controversy around this plant when there's no scientific evidence anywhere, research that shows that it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Yet we're telling young people at like age 18 or 21, whatever it is here now, like, your beautiful rite of passage is you can now go get drunk as often as you want to, but don't smoke that pot.
Yeah. And I think alcohol is one of the most boring drugs there is. It
Oh
makes
my
you
gosh, yeah.
tune out from your life. And that's the difference between
Even socially,
alcohol
yeah.
and entheogens and psychedelics is alcohol
Tune
makes
in,
you tune out, whereas
yeah.
entheogens and psychedelics actually force you. I mean, you are forced, especially on
Literally.
ayahuasca,
Oh yeah,
to
particularly. Yeah.
focus on your life. Like Mother Ayahuasca comes in and says, you need to fix this. And honey, what are you doing there? You need to fix
Yep.
that as well. And
Like it or not.
it
Yeah.
can be a really intense experience. Do you
Yeah.
have any warnings for people thinking of doing ayahuasca? Because it's not all rainbows and butterflies. Like it can be a horrific yet really rewarding experience at the same time, which makes it even more insane.
Yeah. It's not so much a warning as it is the caution, which is the obvious one, is to do your research and make sure that you find a location um, with a group that has a good reputation. And what's really cool is now there's even websites, and I believe Reset Me will do this too, that will actually give you recommendations of various locations in Peru, various places in the world where it's legal, that actually have a good, solid reputation of quality. I think in terms of how they're administering the medicine and the making of it too. And yeah, I feel that's one of the reasons I wanted to do the podcast was particularly in the African American community, is to bring ayahuasca kind of out of the closet, even though it's becoming very popular, as you know, in mainstream media. At the same time, I meet people all the time that go, "Aya what?" That's like the big joke. Is we actually have this T-shirt in our community that says "Aya what," you know, and I just feel like, gosh, the more I have met so many people that are suffering from various ailments that I know from my experience they would be able to heal from if they had access legally to ayahuasca in a safe setting, which of course could be regulated if it were legalized.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's one of the greatest human rights tragedies of this century
Oh
that
my
these
gosh, yeah,
medicines aren't available. You see so
yeah,
many people suffering from addictions, lack of
hmm
spirituality, lack of purpose
connection,
in
yeah,
life. I mean, ayahuasca just isn't for people who are ill. It's also, I believe it can help almost everybody. If you're just stuck in a rut and you just need
mm,
to kind of step outside of your life to then reevaluate decisions you're making and really
yeah,
choose your correct path. And that's often what causes a lot of anxiety and
yeah,
depression when you're not on that right path.
exactly.
And
Yeah,
ayahuasca points you in that direction.
just that lack of, yeah, as you bring up connection, I call it. I, you know, it's interesting. The reason why I started advocating and being supportive of entheogens just being legalized and more widely acceptable was I was doing a lot of political activism for a while, like going to rallies and carrying signs and marching and yelling. And at this one rally in LA, I remember like we got over this overpass on the freeway, and it was the one place that the police had not kind of like, they presented themselves as, oh yeah, we're going to support your rally, your march, so we're going to have guards, posted. What they were actually doing was protecting the route. So really, only people that were already aware of what we were doing were present, right? So we were very ineffective. But we get to this overpass where suddenly we could be seen by the traffic. So everybody ran over and were holding their signs up. All of a sudden, the police were really active and like keeping us from doing that. But somehow I had this little awakening in that moment. I suddenly stopped and I thought, this is a complete waste of time. Like, I'm really glad that there are people that are active on the front lines with all the issues, humanity is facing right now. But I thought, and subsequently after that, I fell into this depression. And I was able at the time to pretty much lock myself into my house for like 2 weeks and just read poetry and spiritual texts. And, I'd been drinking ayahuasca and I wanted to understand that more. And from that, I had the most obvious epiphany. I thought, well, gosh, actually, all of the problems humanity is facing are stemming from a lack of connection, if you look at it really. And a lack of connection spiritually or a lack of a sense of connection to our greater environment, basically, and to each other. And I thought, so the real problem we're facing, the evolution that needs to take place, is in consciousness. And I thought, well, that's it. That's where I'm going to do my work. So for me, my work with the advocacy and support of entheogenic use is a form of activism, without a doubt. The evolution of human consciousness, my entire life shifted so that everything I do from music to working with young people is all around the evolution of human consciousness, period. Yeah, so obviously entheogens play a huge and valuable role in that.
How is it that you think that, in our conversations before,
Mm,
you've brought up that you think that ayahuasca would be a tremendous asset to bring into the inner cities and especially in Black communities, communities
absolutely.
carrying so much trauma.
Mm.
How do you think ayahuasca could help these communities?
It's such a huge subject, and we touched on this a little bit prior to this formal meeting. But I watched this beautiful documentary on the BBC. I think it's called "The Ghost in Our Genes." Yeah, and these two researchers, I think it's Marcus and Pembrey, they're able to prove. I'm very condensing this information, but their research basically shows that the trauma that our great grandparents experienced, even further back, affected their genes literally. And to their amazement, young people born like 2 or 3 generations later have the same diseases or are affected by the same traumas, basically. So that, overlapping with the work of epigenetics, that yes, we might inherit these disorders from our grandparents that were brought on by some trauma. In this case, their research like a famine that took place. But now we know that we're not confined to our genes, to our DNA. And that, and with research I did on the placebo effect, particularly at the last MAPS conference I was at, a lot of the researchers were sharing that, wow, we realize now that what's been missing from a lot of our research on things like ayahuasca is the set and setting. And one of the reasons that they're so effective is that you actually have a group of people in an intentional setting, working with a leader or shaman in this case, ayahuasquero. The very fact that everybody is there with the intention of healing, you mix that intention and placebo effect with epigenetics and our ability to turn switches on and off. And I started realizing through my own experience, which we'll talk about, I go, wow, absolutely, ayahuasca has the ability to take you into the trauma. And not only that, I'm convinced that it's actually flipping switches on and off because a lot of people are being healed by things that nothing else has been able to heal them from.
And so, what ways have you seen? You've worked with people
Mm,
who, from these communities, who have taken ayahuasca and had their lives transformed.
mhm.
Can you explain some of those ways?
Well, I'll just use my own as an example and relating this to the African American community. I did an ayahuasca monologue. They're actually called the ayahuasca monologues, and they're on YouTube. And in mine, I shared this experience I had. I was invited to do a ceremony. It was all men, and I was very intrigued by that. And during this ceremony, I'm condensing the story dramatically. At some point, I'm in ceremony, and I become aware that there's a man standing next to me. which was no big deal. But at some point I kind of like, I'm singing the songs, and the ayahuasca thing is very beautiful and having this experience of like, oh, my brotherhood, I'm here with all the guys. And then I start realizing like, wait, everybody that is participating in this ceremony is accounted for. Like, who's this person standing next to me? And I look over and lo and behold, it's my father who had died 5 years earlier. Right?
Wow.
Yeah. And as vividly standing next to me as I'm, you sitting in front of me. And talk about, I'm tripping, that's what I'm thinking. But so this vision, I'll call it, of my father says to me, oh, I'm glad I have your attention. Let's go take a walk. So, of course, in the ceremony, you're not allowed to leave. So I asked permission from the leader. I said, hey, my father's here. Where else are you going to say to somebody, my dad's here, he passed away? And they go, oh, cool.
Only in an ayahuasca ceremony would they
Exactly, right?
understand that. It is a common
It is very
theme that
common.
people are visited by loved
Exactly.
ones
Yeah.
who've passed away.
Yeah. And so, long story short, he says, yes, as long as you stay within visual range, we need to see you. So I go journeying with my father. And in that experience, basically, through this conversation, what happens in the condensed version is that my father, his father, and my mother's father all appear to me. And they basically say, we brought you here because we want to apologize for the abuse that you suffered growing up. And my family, it's a very interesting and dicey topic to always get into with the African American culture, is the form of discipline, which is like spanking or beating or whipping, whatever they call it, is really commonplace. And so much so that growing up, that was normal. And I assumed, like, well, this is just the way kids are raised. And as I kind of grew up and started meeting other kids in school, I was actually shocked to find out that I was meeting like really good friends who were awesome, who told me, like, what, you're kidding? My father's never hit me. I'm like, no. Like, how did you turn out okay? you know? So I'm like reflecting on that, thinking, God, it's really strange. So in this experience, suddenly, as they're saying this, I am transported back. It was like that near-death experience that people talk about at the end of life, where I'm suddenly replaying my life. And I'm watching all of these experiences of me being, doing simple things like dropping a glass and breaking it. And then my father or grandfather's response would be to come with a belt, and beep, 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 beep. And it just seemed like, well, that's what you do. So as I'm watching all of that, I'm realizing what an effect that had on me and how that actually wasn't okay for a little very sensitive, 5 or 6 year old. And that vision turned into me seeing them being beaten by their fathers and their fathers and their fathers. All the way back, this vision goes to me watching slaves in Africa running through grasses being chased by either their own people or Europeans coming to bring slaves to America. And then it clicked. I'm like, oh my gosh. And all these like ancestors, my father and their fathers, in that moment they're saying, yes, like this is something we inherited it. We don't know any other way. And we apologize because we realize, the reason it was passed down to you is because it was passed down to us. And this trauma within our community goes all the way back to slavery. There's no way around it. And in that moment, it was such a huge release of pent up both anger, frustration, all the pain and suffering that was caused from that. And as you mentioned, earlier, there is this sense of liberation. And it may seem simple, but in reality, what happened in that moment was I realized I feel like I'm standing in my own skin and my own body and consciousness for the first time in my life. I was like liberated, right?
Wow.
So much so that it felt like, I don't even know who this person is without that story, running in the background. So it was a tremendous help to me, and other things happen related to that are in this monologue. But that was the basis of it. So what I started seeing was like, wow, the African American community, particularly, is so anti-drug, and appropriately so because of how it's destroyed the community. But they're literally talking about drugs that were, as we know, kind of introduced into that community by now. There's research, that proves it was by the CIA at some point. So they have this really interesting relationship with drugs because so many African American men are in prison from drug-related causes, either selling it or using it. So there's this whole stigma now that I feel like something like ayahuasca, which could be incredibly beneficial for my community, has such a stigma on it, that they wouldn't even go near it. But I feel like, I'll be the poster child, and a lot of other amazing African American people I know that now use ayahuasca are reporting the same thing. Like, wow, this could so liberate and benefit our community in our culture. Yeah.
Because I feel too, out of any culture in the US, I mean, just with the history of slavery and just
Mm.
constant oppression, there has to be so much trauma
There
just
has to be.
built into the DNA.
Yeah. Yeah. There has to be. And from the inside out, actually being raised in that community and being an African American, it's difficult to bring up these subjects. Like, I believe her name is Dr. Joyce O'Leary. She started touring around doing this lecture series that was basically called post-traumatic slave syndrome. That was really rejected early on, not only by established, I know the psychiatric community, because to call it a syndrome, it has to be approved as one, but also within the African American community, because what she was basically saying was the reason we are the way we are is because we're all descendants of slaves. And we are the result of a culture that was extremely traumatized. And she goes on in this lecture to explain all the reasons why. And I was gripped by that because I knew what she was saying was basically true. Maybe not all the details of it, but the overall essence of it was true because I lived it in my own experience.
Mhm.
Yeah, so for me, because I know that is true, and I know that as a culture, as most cultures or people of color in the United States, to some degree, you are the descendants of a group of people that were traumatized. And not that Europeans weren't. That's why they came here, right? They're also escaping their own trauma and oppression. But my life took off because of that experience that I did in the all-male ayahuasca ceremony. I really felt like, wow, I am now liberated to kind of like move on this planet in an authentic way and accomplish what I want to do, have the kind of authentic relationships with people that I want to have, and a depth of love that I know is possible that was all being shrouded and controlled by this trauma that was always hiding in the background. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
had a similar
Similar. Yeah.
experience, and I think people don't even realize that they're carrying around
Yeah.
centuries of trauma, but they're
And
not
how could you?
happy.
Yeah.
They're depressed, anxious. They can't figure out what's causing this,
Right.
and it's because we don't have many ways. We've taken it out of Western civilization ways
Mm.
to purge this trauma, whereas Native
Yeah.
cultures have used entheogens and
Mm-hmm.
psychedelics for thousands of years to just purge these layers of pain and hurt. And
Exactly.
it's such a shame that people don't have access to this widely across the United States, especially.
I was reading this book, and it could be the wrong book. I think it might have been Wizard of the Upper Amazon. Um, and ayahuasca is discussed in there, but there's some section of it, and I'm hoping it's the right book. But very briefly, this ceremony is talked about somewhere in Amazonia where once or twice a year, the whole community gets together and they brew the form of what might be alcohol now. It's kind of a beer substance, but and here's an appropriate use for alcohol, right? But the whole purpose of this particular festival was that because they realized in order for tribes to survive, they all have a role and they all must get along, right? Because they've got each other's back. So this ceremony, what the shaman, you might say in this context of our conversation, would do is, okay, now is the time to bring up all of those confrontations that you've been like dealing with or hiding. So people were actually encouraged to get drunk and fight it out. It's like, yeah, this is the time we're going to do that, right? And but the point was they recognized the importance of bringing to light hidden animosities, hidden traumas, whatever it is, so that the tribe could actually at all times be healthy and survive, basically, in the wild. So I realized, these kinds of rites of passages that we don't offer, at least in any legitimate form, in Western culture overall, are, it's been replaced with like graduating high school, or yeah, now you get to go out and have your first night of drinking legally with your buddies. That's like a rite of passage in this culture.
Yeah, or we send them people to college who don't even know who they are.
Yeah,
How are
or
they
what they
supposed
actually
to
want to
pick
do.
their careers?
Yeah,
And that's what happens.
and it's considered a rite of passage. You graduated, yay!
And they're not in touch with their true selves, and they end up picking these careers that aren't their true paths in life,
Exactly.
and then they end up depressed and anxious and unsatisfied the rest of their
Yeah,
lives. Like,
exactly.
we need that rite of passage. That's what we've taken out of
It's
Western
crucial.
culture.
Yeah, it's crucial. As you know, I started an organization called the I Am Life Project, and it's a youth empowerment project. But one of its cores is basically that. We realized, wow, these amazing youth we're running into, what's missing is rites of passages and connections and relationships with elders, right? So we focus on that, on authentic indigenous rites of passages, kind of updated so they make sense, in the context of our culture. And it's had a huge impact on the youth that are participating. They're having these beautiful relationships with like Native American elders and other elders in different cultures that they've gotten exposed to. But the difference I see in them, simply from being able to go and do like a Native American vision quest, where at the end of that, you're actually acknowledged by your community as having gone through some rite of passage. Like, we acknowledge that you have stepped into another level of, let's say, maturity, right? And so we can relate to you in a different way. And I realize, if you don't have that, what you end up with instead is like gang culture, because young people know, particularly for boys, as testosterone comes on, you're going through puberty, there's power surging, and society has to, in some way, both acknowledge that and put it to use in some way. And if it's not being offered, it will become destructive instead. Yeah, and oftentimes, they've talked to gang members that, later, I don't know what you call like post gang. Oftentimes, they'll say that that was the motivation, was this acknowledgement that they received. That they were being received and acknowledged as powerful and having, skills and something to offer. And I thought, well, bingo, we're not offering that. Instead, we're saying, go get a degree you don't need. you know,
Yeah.
yeah, you might need it if you've decided for sure you want to be an anthropologist. But I just met somebody recently, classic, who graduated after 5 years, amazing degree, and basically told me like, I want to go to an ayahuasca ceremony because I have no idea what to do with myself. you know,
And that's what ayahuasca is so
yeah,
beautiful in doing it. It really, for me personally, it's like laid out a map for my life.
yeah, right.
It's almost like it got into my mind and was just knew what I should be doing,
Mm,
what I shouldn't be doing, and one of those is doing what I'm doing now, is focusing on ways to help people heal trauma.
thankfully,
The ayahuasca told me, Amber, you have this all wrong. You're just
yeah,
focusing on the symptoms, the wars, the
exactly.
slavery.
And me too, early on.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
with your protesting, and it's like over and over, it just kept showing me like, why are you wasting your time? The
Mm,
core root of all of our problems on this planet are that people have not found ways to purge themselves on the individual level of
purgatory.
trauma.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's so amazing about these medicines is that they're so empowering. They teach us that you can change the world by just changing yourself and healing yourself, and
And
you
we
have
hear
that
that,
power.
yeah, we hear that all the time. And even as a young man doing like social activism work, even hearing that phrase, another part of me was like, well, it's also kind of silly. I can't really change the world by changing myself. Later, lo and behold, it's not true. That's the only way, actually. And what I mean by that is it's interesting. A lot of amazing people I've met over the years have said something to this effect that in the West, we don't have very developed language for talking about spiritual experiences because it's been so condemned. So when I'm about to say, yeah, it starts moving into that realm where it sounds kind of woo-woo. But it's true. What I started realizing through the work with ayahuasca and entheogens in general, that you do start to realize that you are connected to other people, right? And there is a collective consciousness that we share. So even by, well, I look at the work of like the Institute of Heart Math, right? And some people find that science kind of bogus, but I'm reading more and more people doing similar work, and it basically is showing that our emotional states, on layman's terms, get encoded into the electromagnetic field that the heart produces. And they believe it's why you can tell when somebody's looking at you. Like when I walk into a room before you and I meet, these fields that we're projecting are meeting already, right? So they're saying that, and not only are we communicating to each other through these fields, we're also tapped into the planetary electromagnetic field, and probably beyond, right? So I look at that and I think in my own life, what I've seen and what people have reported back through ayahuasca work and entheogenic work in general is that they suddenly tap into that field and they suddenly realize, wow, I really am everybody else in the room. And who I am and what I'm thinking and how I'm being on the planet really is having an effect beyond me, right? So the fact that we don't completely fully understand that, or I would probably say have forgotten it, doesn't mean that it's not legitimate,
Mm.
and doesn't make a difference. And I've had enough experience now beyond mm, cohesive, accepted language that describes it to know in my own experience that it's true.
So 18 years
18,
drinking
hard to
ayahuasca.
believe.
Yeah, you must have no ego whatsoever. I'm assuming it's
Well,
been
here's the funny
completely
thing about
dissolved
that.
by
My
now.
friends would definitely argue that differently. But, the difference is, it's funny you bring that up, the ego, because a lot of Western spirituality, well, which we actually inherited from the East, so that's not completely true, it's all about this idea of the ego, right? Of diminishing the ego. And what the gurus, really the spiritual teachers, are saying is it's really not about diminishing your ego. It's being able to function without that being in the driver's seat, basically.
Mhm.
Let me tell you, ayahuasca, as you know, will handle that in one session.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it shows you this very clear distinction between the truth of who you are, right? I wouldn't want to call that like your eternal state of actual presence and being, versus this program that we're all running on, which is really all the ego is. It's kind of this downloaded, programmed. I call it a survival tool, basically, which is necessary. If we didn't have an ego, we would like step in front of a train, or allow ourselves to be a doormat, and just be taken advantage of. So fortunately, we do have this mechanism that is all about self-preservation. that kicks in regardless of your thought process and basically preserves your physical existence, I think. But with that, in Western culture particularly, really all over the world, but I think Western culture is the dominant now culture, exported all over the world. Um, the ego now looks like capitalism run amok, basically, fake forms of democracy, and it looks like over-identification with fundamentalist anything, whether it's Christianity or political doctrine. I find all of those to be manifestations of ego, basically.
And can you tell us about, so many people write me, I get dozens of
Mm.
emails. What is an ayahuasca experience like? What? And it's almost like describing a dream after you've woken up. You can remember some things. It gets a little crazy. It's
Yeah.
very mystical. It's terrifying and healing. Let's go back to your first ayahuasca session. Can
Oh
you,
boy, not a good one, but
18 years ago,
well,
can
okay.
you tell us, describe for us where you
Yeah.
were and what happened
The
after
funny
after
thing
you?
about that is that after my first ayahuasca experience, I remember, even though it was mind blowing quite literally, the next day, the friend and I that participated, actually, well, yeah, these two, we both said the same thing. That was really cool. I'm never doing that again for a whole bunch of reasons, because it's uncomfortable, as you know, and may not be. It can be obviously exquisite too. Um, you
But
know,
how did you get connected with the medicine? How did you first find
I
it?
was definitely, this was now again 18 years ago, ayahuasca was definitely not popular and not accessible really in the United States. So what happened was I was running a business in Long Beach. It was called Living Planet, which was the first all organic kind of coffee house, at least in Long Beach. I don't know about Southern California. And because of that, we were drawing in a lot of alternative kind of like spiritual people. And I wasn't quote unquote a spiritual person at the time. I opened that place because I was an activist. I was very concerned with the environment. So the idea of an all organic, kind of socially responsible, fair trade business really appealed to me. Well, of course, what we started drawing in was a lot of very alternative counterculture people. And that experience turned into us offering drum workshops and all kinds of people coming out of the woodworks wanting to do everything from like pagan, ritual studies to artists like Lane Redmond, amazing frame drummer who recently passed away, who changed all of our lives because she brought this frame drum into the shop, Living Planet, and did this workshop. And with that, though, gave this lecture about the history of women playing the frame drum and how they were actually the first recorded musicians, first drummers on the planet. So I bring that up because during that process, I started really awakening to, it started to condition my mind to be open to the possibility that I basically didn't have a full grip on reality. Like a lot of what I was being told about history and the world wasn't true. So all of these experiences primed me for this guy walking in one day and saying, hey, there's this ayahuasca experience coming up. And if you guys, it's closed, but if you're interested, I'd like to invite you. And like a lot of people, I said, I what?
Yeah, and
And
it's not like you could have just gone on the internet at that point
no, there was
and
no
searched it
internet.
up, read people's trip reports.
Yeah.
You were flying blind there. That's pretty brave.
Completely. Well, the thing is, I was so open because of the experience of running this place. So what happened was there were a lot of things going on in my life that just weren't kind of quite working. So I was like prime, like, well, I'm open to a new experience, and I've been exposed to a lot of different things because of this place. Um, so what happened was really, really interesting. When I asked him, I what, he said, well, have you seen the movie Emerald Forest or Emerald Jungle? I think it's called Emerald Forest. And yeah, I had, and I love that film. And he goes, well, it's like that. So because of that, I had this idea like, oh, we're going to be in the jungle, crawling around. I'm going to connect with the spirit animals. So I had this whole romanticized notion based on this film, The Emerald Forest, of what was going to happen. And what he didn't tell us was it was actually ayahuasca experience through the Santo Daime Church, right? Which is very, very beautiful. But it was so contradictory to the story I had built up that we go to this ceremony.
So you're sitting like in a church. For those that don't know about Santo Daime, it's one of the
Yeah,
ayahuasca religions. It mixes
exactly.
Catholicism
It's a
with
Judeo-Christian
ayahuasca.
religion, basically, syncretic. Yeah, predominantly Judeo-Christian with ayahuasca and, Yoruba, Candomblé, like all these different elements of Amazonian slash Afro-Cuban religions get kind of all mixed in. It's beautiful because of that. But definitely throughout it, you're hearing Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And if you're a Catholic or a Christian, you'll be perfectly at home in the Santo Daime
So how did
ayahuasca
you feel
experience.
sitting at the church? They give you the brew.
Yeah, so here's the thing. I've got this jungle story in my head, and we go into the ceremony, and actually there's like a cross on the table, and all the people leading have little like uniforms on that they call fardas, and they start singing these hymns, and well, we drink, and they're singing these hymns and they're playing these, they call maracas, shakers, and cans, so they're loud. And let me tell you, I was crawling out of my skin. I hated every minute of it. I'm like, those high shrill voices, these crazy can sounds. And really what was happening was, my first thought was, oh, I thought I was going to this beautiful jungle thing and I'm in a cult. So I had this whole story the whole time, like they're trying to control me. So I wasn't open to the experience. But what ended up happening, condensing this experience, was I wasn't feeling anything. And I was convinced that everybody around me was like faking it. So at some point I actually leave the ceremony and I find a phone somewhere in this setting. I don't know how I did that. And I call my friend and he goes, what are you doing calling me in the middle of a ceremony? And I go, oh, dude, this thing is totally bogus. Nothing's really happening. There's all these people upstairs faking this experience and I wasted my money. So one of the facilitators comes down and goes, what are you doing on the phone? And I'm like, oh, here come one of the Nazis. My exact words. So long story short, he brings me back upstairs. He goes, you should really have a second drink. And I'm like, oh no, here we go. So I stand in line, have the second drink, purely out of exasperation. I'm so over this experience that I finally, the surrender moment, however it comes, I cross my arms, which you're not supposed to do for reasons I'll talk about. And I finally just kind of collapse into my chair, right? My head explodes. And in that moment, finally, I have this first ever, because here's the funny thing about me, no, outside of smoking pot occasionally, had done no experimentation whatsoever with psychedelics. So I wasn't even familiar with altered states of consciousness outside of smoking marijuana. So for me, it was a mind-blowing experience just for that alone. And it was this beautiful visionary state that unfolded that the details wouldn't make sense to anybody but me. But the funny thing about that was, at some point, purely like ego kind of like wanting to hide, I get on the floor I find out this later, and kind of crawl behind my chair because I wanted to purge. And I'm thinking like, oh, I'm going to purge so nobody hears me, And in my head, I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've been such an asshole. I am such an asshole. So the next day, my good friend Sonny goes, oh, no, you were saying that out loud. I was like, what? Blown away. But that was the beauty. What happened was, it was my first ever experience of really being confronted with my ego. So the fact that it exposed me in that way ended up being the actual best medicine for me. So that's why later I said, that was really cool. I'm never doing that again. And I'm convinced that it's probably bad for you and will make me crazy, right? Well, the funny thing was, during that experience, the predominant thought in my mind as I'm having this other multidimensional time travel experience was, in the background, I kept hearing myself say, oh, my poor mother, she's going to be so disappointed. I'm going to be one of those people now that just wanders on Venice Beach, mumbling. Because I was just ignorant. Like I had really, like all of us, and from what I understand, you too, I had really bought into the story that psychedelics were just bad for you, and that I was going to be crazy and mentally deranged. The absolute opposite was true. Yeah.
And so you're sitting there, you're getting these visionary experiences. Can you, it's hard to describe, but can you describe for someone who hasn't tried ayahuasca before what those experiences are like, or these visions were like?
It's one of the, as I said earlier, we don't have a really evolved language for talking about these experiences. But one of the things early on that I questioned about ayahuasca and all entheogenic experiences was, I thought, this is my mental self at the time thinking, if these experiences are authentic and what I'm experiencing is quote unquote true, then why isn't everybody experiencing the same thing, right? And what I later got through an ayahuasca experience and through work with like Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, was we all actually have our own kind of mythic landscape, right? Probably both culturally induced and just maybe through your own life experience. And what I started to realize was that ayahuasca, referred to as Mama Ayahuasca, the intelligence, which it could be your own higher self, who knows, but the intelligence that appears and communicates to you in ayahuasca, what it revealed to me was, pure intelligence or consciousness, awareness is existing in a terrain, we'll call it, beyond language. Language is, a construct, that's why there's so many of them. So what you're actually getting are pure kind of thought forms or ideas that have to be translated to make sense to you. So because what happened was, I realized after this one ceremony, this new idea of integration started coming into ayahuasca ceremonies, where there would be like sharing circles afterwards, right? And I realized in this one ceremony, actually, a lot of us did have the exact same experience. The same information came, but it appeared to each person in the most poignant, personal way possible, basically. So for me, I was having these amazing visions of like um, this huge row of like choir robes lined up on into infinity. Now I come out of a Southern Baptist background, so that was really a recognizable image to me. You know, what it brought up to me was safety of religion, basically. And my mom was a choir director. We learned to sing in the choir. So that was really comforting. But all of a sudden, those choir robes all became the wings of butterflies, and they took off in every direction. That's how my journey actually started. So it like really caught my attention. And from that, basically a lot of beautiful, this like pantheon of beautiful, mythic, kind of archetypal images that basically through just through imagery unfolded a whole story that started to reveal myself to myself, basically in terms of like how I came to be who I was and how I was kind of constructed, basically. Which is why at some point, as it kind of finally caught up to present day, and I was looking at my behavior within my community and my close friends, I started saying like, oh my gosh, I have been such an asshole and didn't realize it. And that's how I ended up crawling around the chair saying, you're such an asshole, you know? But I was saying it from a really affectionate place, like, I had no idea I was being an asshole.
And that's the beauty of psychedelics is
Absolutely.
because you get in that train of
Self-reflection.
thought and you don't
Yeah,
even realize you're doing things or harming others with your action.
exactly.
But psychedelics definitely will let you know
Well,
what's
yeah.
up.
You know, interestingly enough, years later, I met my first, what I would call like, again, the language in the West, first real like profound spiritual teacher. Not from reading books, everything's like teaching you, but I met Gangaji, who comes out of the Advaita tradition of non-duality, non-dual teachings from India. She's Western. And I got introduced to this concept of self-inquiry. And within the Advaita tradition, what they say is, you know, when you reach this level of spiritual study, it's considered the last teaching. It's the last study because basically you transcend the need to be in a study outside of yourself. The whole study is self-inquiry. It's actually looking within and looking at your own experience and being able to trust that just through observation, right, and tapping into um, this really present state of awareness, you can actually see exactly what's going on in any given moment in a situation. You can actually look at the world and trust yourself to analyze what's going on around you and be able to cognize that in a way that makes sense to you, that you could actually do an analysis, basically. Um, I'm, I'm very westernizing these teachings. But I got that through ayahuasca. I started to understand like it actually all is about self-inquiry, you know, about really going into the self. It's through yourself that you can connect with the rest of the world, that you can um, in my case, look at all the quote unquote problems in the world that I was trying to solve through protesting, which is basically reacting. And then I want to qualify, we definitely need protesters. I love that there are people on the front lines bringing our attention constantly to these problems. The problem with that is that they all know too is that it's not an effective tool overall because what we're always doing is like, you know, problem reaction, problem reaction.
Just pointing at the symptoms over and over
Exactly.
and
I go
over.
symptom, 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 wrong, 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 wrong. You know, I go, and I thought that's fine, and I appreciate those folks, but because I am somebody who's capable of, actually making a difference, as I started to see myself, where I want to go is to the front lines, like the real front lines. And to me, the real front lines are consciousness. You know, it's no way around it. It's evolving consciousness. So,
One thing that uh, fascinates me and I think terrifies some people
mm.
are the purging process
Yeah.
of taking ayahuasca. And
Glad you
that's,
brought that up.
yeah, and that's what makes, I think that's what makes it so ridiculous when people say that ayahuasca needs to be Schedule 1 and can be abused because it's non-addictive. It's proven to actually increase serotonin levels in the
Absolutely.
brain. And when you're on it, it would be impossible to go to a club or just hang
Oh
out with
my
your
gosh.
friends
It is so not a recreational substance. It's
because
ridiculous.
you're getting sick for some people
Yeah.
out of both ends pretty
Everywhere.
violently.
Yeah. You know, ayahuasca works as a purgatory, meaning it causes you to purge. The most dramatic form is, you know, actually like vomiting, you know, or like in either end. But people also purge emotionally. There's sweating in ceremonies, crying, laughter. Some people start laughing and can't stop, you know. But then later, when they explain what they're experiencing, that was their purge. It was a cathartic experience of this uncontrollable laughter. Maybe that's been suppressed for years. Who knows? But it's definitely working, at least initially, by allowing you to purge whatever it is that is the source of the dis-ease. And I say that really carefully because people are being healed by physical ailments as well. But through my years of working with the medicine, all of that always ends up being connected to going to the source, as you brought up earlier, of whatever is the impetus or the cause of the disease. Yeah.
And some shamans call it getting well. And
Oh
so,
yeah, when
we
you
would call it
purge, you
getting
get
sick.
well. Yeah. Yeah, mainly because you're so nauseous and just uncomfortable by the time that happens. You're so grateful when the purge finally happens, in whatever form it happens. It's like, oh my gosh, thank God, you know. And then suddenly, though, for most people, the purge is kind of the apex of the experience in a sense, because everything's been building up to that, and then finally you purge out this thing, and then you're just with the medicine and the ceremony in such a beautiful way because you're no longer processing or fighting this discomfort, basically. Yeah. So that's why it's called getting well. You suddenly feel like, oh my gosh, yeah, you feel fantastic.
I know, I found it phenomenal that the next day, after violently vomiting an
Mhm.
entire night, I just felt great.
Yeah,
Like I could
exactly.
go run 5
And it's
miles,
so counterintuitive. I mean, again, it's like that ego thing. Like naturally, it's going to kick in and tell you, hey, your heart rate is slowing down or speeding up, or your breathing is getting shallow or speeding up. Hey, you feel sick. So you're getting these signals from your brain, your ego, telling you this is not good for you,
Mhm.
right? So you should do whatever is necessary to get out of this experience because it's probably going to kill you, right? And what you realize is the opposite is true. Suddenly, yeah, when the purge comes, all of that is blown out the window, and then you sit there in this space of like, oh my gosh, it's like for some people, in my case, definitely the best I'd felt in my entire life. Yeah,
And
honestly.
and I think ayahuasca behaves like a medicine should, and we're
Mm,
so disoriented in the West as to what a medicine is and what a
yeah,
drug is, and more of our prescription medications behave more like drugs. They just mask the symptoms. They make you feel
exactly.
great when you're on them, but then you
Yeah,
need them the rest of your life. Whereas like the ayahuasca experience can be a little bit hellish, but then the next day you wake up feeling great,
yeah.
and you don't need it
And
anymore.
most people are unwilling. It's so fascinating to me. And again, I think it's part of how Western culture has developed, void of and actively stamping out these ritual processes of catharsis, right? Of voluntarily going into uncomfortable situations so that you can benefit on the other side of that. And I think it's probably just a product also of just capitalism slash materialism, this idea of constantly let's buy more things to make life more comfortable. Don't go spend your money or your time investing on something that's going to be uncomfortable, even if it's good for you. And then you brought up the thing with pharmaceuticals. The big joke to me is like the vast majority of them, at least the ones you can buy over the counter, you read them and it just common sense is telling you, it's saying very clearly to treat symptoms of. None of them say we're helping you cure anything, with rare exception, right? Yeah, so all they're doing is basically giving you relatively ineffective ways and poisonous and toxic ways of dealing with the symptoms of the actual thing that you want to heal. So I find that really absurd. So I think because that a lot of people, it's kind of a foreign notion to, well, instead I want to actually go be uncomfortable, but knowing that this uncomfortable experience could actually transform my life. Yeah, and because that's not that awareness or a practice isn't, I don't know, obvious or available in our culture, it seems very counterintuitive. Where in a lot of indigenous cultures, that makes perfect sense. It's like, hey, I don't feel really well. Hey, take this plant, it'll make you throw up. That's just common knowledge, all over Amazonia. Here, people are like, you got to be kidding. I want to take something that like makes me feel good, and I don't have to throw up. Like, well, guess what? In life, you get to throw up. That's what it's about.
Let's talk a little bit about safety. Who should not be taking ayahuasca? Are there any
Mm,
limitations? I know that definitely antidepressants are a no-no.
absolutely. Yeah.
Can you explain to people what concerns should be addressed safety wise?
There's really only two that are dominant. One is any kind of antidepressant, antihistamines, basically MAO inhibitors. Too complicated a subject to get into here, but you'd have to just, I would say, just do your homework. There is a category of pharmaceuticals that you absolutely should not be on if you want to have an ayahuasca experience. And a lot of people that will go to Peru or wherever to do ayahuasca, they'll contact a doctor, and because it's legal there, to go, I'm going to do this. So what I want to know is how do I get off this? And that's what people do. The doctors will help them for a period of time get off the substances, or at least down to a safe level. There are very few of them that are safe, so that you can have the experience and then either be off it if it's successful and success rate is really high, or to ease back onto it when you're done. So if you're on any kind of prescription medication, you want to basically, which is fortunately now available through sites like yours and on the internet, um, just write in contraindications for ayahuasca, and poof, it'll pop up all the things you don't want to be on. The other category of people are, this is a, the jury's still out on this one actually. When I talked to one of my mentors, Neil Marshall Goldsmith, I contacted him once about a young man that wanted to travel to do an ayahuasca experience, who I thought was a little questionable psychologically, put it that
Mhm.
way. And I contacted Neil, and he said, this is what we know, or what we think we know, to quote him directly. Ayahuasca does not cause psychotic behavior, but it can trigger it if you're predisposed to it. But then the jury's out on whether or not that's bad, because um, if it's going to come up anyway, and the onset is usually around the age of 27, ironically, this young man was 27.
That's for like
Yeah,
schizophrenia or
schizophrenia, things like.
uh-huh.
Well, he actually said schizoid behavior was his
Okay.
exact word. He said it doesn't cause schizoid behavior, but if you're predisposed to it, it may trigger it. And not in everybody. But then he says, maybe that's the perfect place. If it's going to happen anyway, in the context of a legitimate quote unquote shaman or facilitator, and over a period of time, which is exactly what has transpired, by the way, for this young man, sure enough, his schizoid behavior was triggered. I was very concerned about it. But rather than, which I couldn't do anyway because he's an adult, his family contacted me and said, hey, our friend just got back from wherever he was traveled to do this experience, and we're concerned about his behavior. And I said, well, look, he's an adult. You can't tell him not to do it. So let's see what happens. And sure enough, now it's been a year, and it's been a transformation.
And what is the importance of set and setting? I know set, this is said over and over again when it comes to
Yeah,
taking these
that's
medicines,
like the
as it is.
foundation. Absolutely.
And set is your mindset. It's what you go in wanting from the medicine, what type of healing you
Right.
want.
The
Um,
intention.
and setting is also where you're doing it.
Yeah, the set is just that. It's your personal mindset, intention, and of the person facilitating. I combine the two. And the setting is the actual, both are intention based, basically. Um, yeah, is the setting appropriate, for the experience to unfold in? Is there a qualified sitter or facilitator present with experience? Is the setting that you're in conducive to the experience to unfold in? Meaning as opposed to you're at a rave and decide you're going to do DMT, which people do, which personally I think is crazy, but that happens.
How do you get the ideal setting for someone? Maybe someone's not necessarily doing ayahuasca. Maybe they're
Mm.
doing another entheogen. Maybe they're choosing to do it in their home. Not that we advocate any illegal
Oh yeah,
behavior,
great. Well, yeah,
but
I'm glad you
how do
brought
you
that up
get?
because we know what's happening anyway.
So we might as well teach people how to do it
Yeah,
safely. And how do you get the ideal setting? Say you're going to do it in your backyard or at home.
yeah.
What would you recommend?
Yeah, basically what we just talked about. One is to have a really clear intention. And I can't stress that enough. A lot of people hear that and think, again, it's kind of airy fairy talk. But, at the last MAPS conference that I was at last January, I think, April maybe, one of the things the researchers were sharing was that they didn't say our research has been flawed, but they've said, one of the things we're realizing is that a major component missing from our research, let's say in this case about ayahuasca, is the intention. Meaning the person is actually coming to the ceremony or to the shaman for a particular reason. So that starts to overlap into kind of the placebo effect. You have an intention for being there to actually do exploration, or to do some kind of self work or healing. So that's part of the setting is be really clear on why you're doing it. First of all, even if what you're saying to yourself is, I just want to experience mushrooms and maybe like trip to some degree.
Every time I've set an intention before a ceremony, I've always had that
Huge difference, right?
addressed.
Exactly.
Definitely. I
Yeah.
just right before I ingest the medicine, I close my eyes and I ask uh, whoever
Right.
for a particular type of healing. I'm
Exactly.
always given that, and maybe it's just all created in my head. Maybe
It's
it's more
irrelevant.
of a spiritual thing. It doesn't matter, but
Yeah.
it's always addressed. So I do agree with you on
Yeah.
that.
I think part of that, like someone who gets a hold of through a neighbor, who knows what, mushrooms, and decides I want to actually explore with this. And again, I want to advocate because we're speaking publicly. I don't advocate casual drug use or even entheogenic use because we know it is illegal here. However, people are doing it anyway and have access to it. So it's important to share, I think, safe and effective uses of it because it's happening anyway. You know, the average teenager I have met over the last year through this I Am Life project, without any exception, every one of them has tried everything I brought up. Yeah, and some of them in not very healthy situations at all. right? So I think it's really valuable to, as we talked, just come out of the closet with the fact that it's available, people are doing it, and the opportunities and potentials are being missed because it's so taboo and being oppressed, right? So this backyard experience, we'll call it, one is to have a clear intention of why you're going to do it. Two is to have a sitter, someone who's experienced that can actually, what we call, hold space for you, so you can go on your journey and can be there in case it goes awry, because it might, you never know.
So
And
that would be like a friend or family member who could maybe
yeah,
answer the door if the
yeah,
doorbell rings,
yeah.
or
Or just like, okay, you're going to go on your next 6 hour experience. I'm going to make sure you're safe, you know. So if you're going to hang out in the backyard for 6 hours and commune with nature, whatever your intention is, having somebody there that knows that you're doing it, that is not on the same substance, that is completely, sober, we call it in default reality, and can basically, we call, hold space, meaning they're going to look out for you and take care of anything, quote unquote, linear that needs to get handled so you can have this experience. And also, there's a sense of safety in that too. You feel much more comfortable going through the more possible difficult passages of an entheogenic experience if you know that somebody's there, like, watching over you. So that's really important. Of course, the other is safety, making sure that whatever it is you're trying comes from a reliable source to the degree that you can do that. And most importantly, again, back when I started this journey, information wasn't available like it is now. Now we have, like, the vaults of Erowid and other, will eventually reset me, I guess, where
yeah,
people
that's
can actually,
erowid.org,
Erowid,
erowid.org. It's a
Erowid, yeah.
fantastic site to go on to if you want to
Fantastic.
look up trip reports, you want to find out about a particular substance, anything
Yeah,
psychedelic related.
yeah, and I love that site because it's so fair. They give you the DEA's take on it. They give you the researchers' take, results of research, very impartial. But then also a lot of, anecdotes, people that are just saying, "This is how I did it, in what setting, and what happened with me, and what I learned," which is really an amazing resource to actually have, outside of the clinical research. So for me, that's most important. Do your homework, find out everything you need to know about the substance that you want to experiment with, and yeah, just be fully informed. The other thing about that is because you'll be a lot more comfortable and secure knowing that you've done your homework and you understand the arc and the effects, basically, of the journey you're going to go on.
How is it that you've seen? I think what's fascinating about ayahuasca is that it's
Mm.
definitely leaving the jungle.
Oh
we,
boy. Yeah.
even in just my year of studying it and working with the medicine, I've seen it really spread
Yeah, it's huge.
across the world. How have you seen it leave the jungle and spread into Western communities?
It's amazing. There's this concept now, we're all dealing with people within the entheogenic community, advocates for their rightful place, I think, in Western culture, well, global culture at this point. This phenomenon we're calling ayahuasca tourism, which initially just referred to all the Americans that flocked to South America to do ayahuasca, rightly so. But because of that, it spurned this whole I don't know what to even call it, like, market there, where you can get off the plane. And it used to be, get bracelets, get, feathers, get llama skin, whatever. Now it's like ayahuasca, ayahuasca in every corner, right? And which, of course, is dangerous, because a lot of these people can make in one ayahuasca journey with one person what they can make sometimes in a whole year, right, of doing this other work. So that's dangerous. Um, in the West, that tourism now is just also included in what we call just the popularity of ayahuasca. There are so many articles now, like LA Weekly, a lot of them, reporting on ayahuasca. It's showing up as scenes in films, and not very favorably. I really think actually really irresponsibly, because again, they are taking the experience and kind of it becomes comic almost,
I've
right?
noticed that too. Like it's almost like
Yeah,
a joke. They take the
exactly.
sacredness out of the medicine that's
And
so
the
important.
effectiveness, yeah. Yeah, the actual effectiveness and the cathartic possibilities and the healing that comes from it. And it just becomes this, like, other funny thing that Western people do to trip, basically. Yeah, which is really a disservice to the possibility. So amongst all of the ayahuasqueros and researchers that I've come in contact with, there's ongoing discussion about, it's on our radar that there is this ayahuasca tourism and popularity. And so now there's a movement towards legalization, how to approach that, and how to come up with, which I'm really, really happy about, standardization of use, which is scary to a lot of shamans because they don't want to have to adhere to some guidelines, right? Because they've been doing this, as you know, for eons.
And shamans are the healers that are
Yeah,
delivering the medicine.
exactly. Or Ayahuasqueros, or
And
in
now
Western
they've
cases,
now
just
left the
facilitators.
jungle, so they're now here. I mean, I've heard of
Traveling, yeah,
friends
of
that live in
course.
the Hamptons that have
Oh yeah.
ayahuasca ceremonies, or it's happening in Los Angeles,
I meet
Chicago.
people every month, that have had an amazing, mind-blowing, life-altering experience, not in Peru, not in Amazonia, in Texas, you
Yeah.
know, right? From a traveling shaman or someone that was able to get ingredients and brew the medicine and smart enough to train themselves to facilitate a ceremony, you know. Yeah, so again, the qualifier, yes, it's illegal, actually in kind of a gray area because, the ayahuasca church in Oregon is now legal. The ayahuasca church in Oregon has been legalized, and the UDV, União de Vegetal, which is another official ayahuasca church, they're legal all over North America as far as I know.
So
Certainly
you're
the United
saying that
States.
ayahuasca isn't completely illegal in the U.S. How can it be accessed legally?
You either have to go at this point. You got two really legal options. You can actually go to Oregon and discover the Santo-Daime Church there, beautiful people there facilitating, and participate in a more Judeo-Christian structured version of that ceremony. Still very, very powerful and worthwhile. Or you got to go to Amazonia. Go to some place where it's legal, and which I highly recommend because you're in the actual jungle and it's a different experience, which is what you had. Yeah.
So otherwise, it's illegal unless you're within the church in the United
Yeah,
States.
unless you're within the one of the two churches, it's legal, or you fly to Amazonia, it's technically illegal. The reason why I say gray area is because DMT is what's illegal. Ayahuasca itself, the T isn't, and the two, it shows up in the what they call the female version of the brew, Psychotropis viridis, the leaves, but it's only active because the vine is there, which the natives call the male aspect of it, Banisteriopsis caapi. That's the actual ayahuasca vine. That is an MAO inhibitor, which we touched on earlier. In very layman's terms, your body breaks down DMT really fast in your stomach, right? Enzymes that do that. The vine actually, it inhibits what's called an MAO inhibitor, inhibits it from those enzymes from breaking it down, right? So it can actually get into the bloodstream and get into your brain, or as I say, actually like commune with you, and meet you. So you have to have the two together, which is really interesting, that synergy. Yeah, so because of that, DMT is illegal. And here's the interesting thing. My first DMT experiences, which happened after my ayahuasca experience, it was legal then. We actually bought DMT right online from a place called like American Chemical Supply. It was like, oh, $100, $30, and we got ayahuasca, and we were like holding these ceremonies, feeling totally okay because it was legal. Within a few months of doing that, it got scheduled. And this friend, we went to purchase it, and he gets like some message from like the DEA say, he wasn't in trouble because it was legal when he ordered it.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, the shite is shut down, and by the way, this is now illegal.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it was like, whoa, right? So basically, it is really recent. Yeah.
And so the Supreme Court has ruled, I think it was in two cases, that these churches can use it under the Religious
Absolutely.
Freedom Restoration Act.
Precisely. And
So you can access it in the U.S. if you don't want to go to
as long
Peru.
as, yeah, it's in the context of these two churches and it's religious use, which it is, it's legal. Otherwise, you got to fly if you want to do it illegally. I'm sorry, legally. Now, needless to say, there are shamans traveling, and I call them like American-born shamans and ayahuasqueros that discovered the medicine, how effective it was, and have led ceremonies ongoing underground because they've needed to.
So it's kind of a form of activism for some of these
Oh,
people.
absolutely. Yeah, they realize through their use, as in my case, I've seen the transformation, both physical healing, mental healing, we'll call spiritual, psychological healing over the years. That, of course, I have to be an advocate. I've seen it literally save lives. As I mentioned, this one young lady was just telling me recently, she said, this was my last straw. She said, I was tired of being depressed. I couldn't even function, basically. And she said, this medicine saved my life. And I haven't used that term yet. It is a medicine. We haven't touched on that. Ayahuasca is all over Amazonia and all over the world, in a lot of places, considered a medicine, which is what it is. That's why it's so fascinating, this whole conversation even about it being a psychedelic or an entheogen. It's like, for hundreds of years, some people say thousands, we don't know if that's true or not, it was used as a medicine, mainly for physical healing. Some of the research shows that ayahuasca being used as a cathartic medicine for like spiritual exploration or healing really kind of synergized with Western tourism. You know, prior to that, people were going to shamans and drinking ayahuasca because they had tumors or like illnesses, or what they called kind of like psychological disorders that the culture would interpret as like witchcraft. Oh, well, that person has really ill thoughts about you. Therefore, they're sending what they would call spiritual darts at you. So we're going to like remove that, right? Didn't matter, it worked, right? Whatever terminology they were using. Yeah, so for me and the group of people that I associate with and know, is really advocacy comes from knowing that we have this incredibly valuable, effective medicine, that doesn't have side effects. It's not harmful. 18 years later, I'm proof of it. And yet at the same time, it's illegal. Yet, as we talked about, you can go buy things that will kill you over the counter if you don't follow directions carefully. So it's literally a form of what I call I don't know, like I'll just say craziness, that well, it's pathological that I think
A
runs through
symptom of
Western
this
culture.
insanity.
Yeah, it's actually the best word. It really is a symptom of the insanity that over-regulation mixed with capitalism has created in our culture.
And I think that's one of the things we want to do with Reset.me is really take this conversation out of the closet. Because
Absolutely.
so many people are doing these medicines. You might as well give them tips on how to do them safely, how to get the most out of their
Right.
experience. And also just give hope to people out there
Yeah,
who feel like there aren't any medicines or any solutions so that they know there's one more step you can try
absolutely.
before you give up. There's another step to take. And
Yeah, and this, yeah, I don't want to come across in our conversation as being like anti-Western medicine. Needless to say, we've made incredible advances that have saved lives, and there are medicines that have saved lives, including I met a young man who went to Amazonia and was able to get off of his antidepressant medication, which he was really grateful for. However, it was anti-anxiety, I think. But he told me, he said, "Bud," he goes, "I have to tell you, I am so grateful for that medicine because at the time that I was having these uncontrollable anxiety attacks, that saved my life. It's just that I wanted to get off of them, right?" So I think for a lot of people, it becomes kind of like your last hope. Like you've tried everything else, you've tried the conventional things, and there is something else available. And for that reason, it needs to be available. I would hope eventually it could be a first line of defense, but at the moment, I'm okay with it being like your last ditch effort.
Thank you so much, Tony, for coming
Thank
on the
you.
show
It's
today.
such
I
an
think you
honor.
were such a wealth of knowledge for our listeners, especially people who are curious about this medicine and
Yeah.
potentially thinking of making the trip down to Peru or
Mhm.
attending one of these underground ceremonies. How can people find out more information about what you've been up to and really follow your work?
I'm glad you asked, and this is the reason why. Because everything that I now do, obviously, I can't, offer ayahuasca because it's illegal here. But the knowledge of it, certainly, I can. But it was through my work with ayahuasca that I started to develop through insights in that the kind of work that I'm doing. So I'm predominantly a musician, as you know. I sing and write music, and I perform with a band called the Love Ant Project. And we started that based on what we were talking about earlier, this research, amazing, through the Institute of Heart Math, that is showing that we're connected through these electromagnetic fields of our heart. And we kind of felt like, gosh, love is such an airy-fairy kind of toss-away concept in our culture. So we thought, through music, we're all artists, let's take that message out to people in a way that's really accessible. So because we were artists, that was a logical way to do it. So although now that project, the Love and Project, has actually it's become synonymous with a band itself. All of our performances, events, music is all around basically promoting this concept, this research. We bring it up in every performance. The other, as I mentioned, is the I Am Life Project, which we're really excited about. That's a youth empowerment project that focuses on two things: interconnectivity, um, the whole concept of that and what it means to be connected, both scientifically and spiritually. And with that, the importance of bringing youth back into good relationship with adults and elders. So we're taking 3 or 4 young people this October to meet the Shipibo and the Yawanawa tribe in Amazonia. And then the following year, we're taking 20 youth, mostly inner city, to meet the Achuar people through the Pachamama
Wow.
Alliance, yeah, to Amazon. Yeah, and that's not to do ayahuasca, although that might happen there. It's really about bringing them into direct contact with indigenous people in Amazonia so that it's not some foreign abstract concept. They're actually meeting these people, sitting in conversation with them, and basically coming up with ways to solve problems that we're mutually facing.
And so what are your websites? What are the websites or pages people can go
Yeah,
to
both
find out more
have
information?
websites under those names, the loveampproject.org, or on Facebook as
LUVAMP
yeah, thank you for bringing that up. We spell it LUVAMP, one
.org.
word, loveamp.org.
Okay.
And the other is I Am Life. We spell it I.am.life. On Facebook, it's spelled that way. And the website, Life Reset Me, is actually gestating, but the page is up for it. And that launches in mid-May with some really exciting content that we're excited about. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tony,
Thank
and
you.
best of luck along all your journeys. And we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us today.
I'm really grateful for the opportunity and thank you for the work you're doing.